You're listening ad-free on Wondery Plus.
12-year-old Adrian Martinez smiled as he pedaled his bike through his dusty neighborhood in Socorro, Texas, on a hot September day in 2005. School was scheduled to open for the fall the next morning, but Adrian was free as a bird today as he cruised the streets of this small city on the Mexican border. If Adrian was being honest, he was pretty excited to start 8th grade. He was a good student with lots of friends, and he loved playing sports after school. Besides, much as he loved summer vacation, the long, hot days could actually get pretty boring. Adrian was already thinking about what he was going to wear for the first day of school. As Adrian rounded the corner onto a street, he waved to a group of boys playing basketball in their driveway, and he also stopped to pet a neighbor's dog. Adrian had always lived in Socorro, Texas, and he felt like he knew almost everybody there. This truly was his home. Adrian skidded to a stop outside of his family's modest home, where he lived with his mother, whose name was Maricela, and his 3 siblings. Adrian was the oldest boy, and his father was not in the picture, so he and his mother were very, very close. And in a way, Adrian sort of felt like he was the man of the house. Adrian knew that his mother was having a really hard time right now. She didn't have a job, and so supporting him and his siblings was really hard. But at least she didn't have to worry about Adrian. He did his best to make sure of that. Adrian laid his bike down in the front yard and ran to the house, taking the steps to the front door 2 at a time. The next morning, Adrian woke up full of excitement and rushed to the bathroom. He'd woken up early to make sure he could claim the shower before his siblings could come out and create a bathroom traffic jam. But when he was toweling off, Adrian began to notice this weird burning sensation in his right leg. As he looked at his leg more closely, he realized the pain was coming from the pink birthmark that ran from his ankle all the way up to his hip. Adrian had always had this mark, but it had never hurt before, so he just kind of shrugged it off and wrapped the towel around his waist and then wandered out to the kitchen to tell his mother. But when his mother kneeled down and gently pressed her palm against her son's leg, she quickly pulled her hand away and looked up at Adrian with concern. His leg felt weirdly hot, as though only this part of his body was running a fever. Adrian's mother stood up and told her son they would get his leg checked out after school. For now, she just rushed him to his room to go change. He'd be late to class if he didn't hurry. That day, after school, Adrian sat on the edge of a doctor's exam table, swinging his legs back and forth. He felt the cold metal of the stethoscope on his chest as his pediatrician, Dr. Andrews, listened to his heart. Adrian shifted in his seat as Dr. Andrews wrapped an itchy cuff around his upper arm to take his blood pressure. Maricela gave her son a sharp look and reminded him to sit still. Then Dr. Andrews told Adrian to lay back on the table and roll up his right pant leg. The physician gently touched the birthmark, and immediately Adrian squirmed. It didn't exactly hurt when the doctor touched him, but it was uncomfortable. Dr. Andrews would confirm that Adrian's leg was still warm, but besides that, it didn't seem like anything was physically wrong with him. He told Adrian and his mother that this was likely just growing pains, because Adrian was starting to go through puberty. The doctor said it was not uncommon for boys to have these mysterious aches and pains as they grew into men. 4 months later, Adrian was out in the street throwing a football back and forth with his buddy Sam, when as he went to go catch the ball, he suddenly realized he couldn't run very well. His right leg suddenly felt heavy, like it was stuck in mud. Adrian had been playing football with his friends every Saturday since seeing Dr. Andrews, and up until today, everything with his right leg had been totally fine. His birthmark on his leg still did burn a bit, but it wasn't too bad. So Adrian told Sam that he had to go home now because of his leg, but he'd see them next weekend. Then he slowly made the short walk down the street back to his house. And once he got home, he went up to his room and he took off his pants, and when he looked in the mirror, he was totally startled at what he saw. His right leg looked significantly bigger than his left leg. For a second, Adrian was terrified, but then he remembered that his doctor, Dr. Andrews, a few months earlier had said this was no big deal and he had nothing to worry about. And so despite what he was seeing in the mirror, Adrian told himself he was just fine, and then he walked away from the mirror, trying hard to forget what he had just seen. A few weeks later, in February of 2006, Adrian hopped on his bike and began riding to school like he did most mornings. But this time, something just felt wrong. As Adrian pedaled down the street, he felt his right leg bump up against the frame of the bike. He also realized that his jeans on his right leg felt unbelievably tight. Adrian slowed to a stop and looked down at his legs. And immediately he could tell through his jeans that his right leg had ballooned in size overnight. He'd never seen it this swollen. But again, Adrian told himself that his doctor said it was fine, so he pushed the thought away and tried to pedal his bike again. But now it was impossible because of how swollen his leg was. Every time he tried to turn the pedal, his right leg really pushed hard against the frame, and it really hurt. Adrian didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't go to school like this. So he stepped off his bike, turned around, and began pushing it along next to him towards his house. And as he walked home, the pain in his right leg was so extreme, he had to fight hard to keep tears back. A couple of weeks later, Adrian sat next to his mother in the doctor's office with his right leg extended out in front of him. It was now so big, it was hard for Adrian to even bend his knee. They were waiting for his latest round of test results. Socorro, Texas was a small city that didn't have that many doctors, but Adrian felt like he'd seen every one of them in the last few weeks. They'd run every test they could think of. Adrian had multiple x-rays, MRIs, and CAT scans done. The doctors hadn't told Adrian or Maricela what exactly they were looking for, but so far, they hadn't found anything. Adrian hoped this new doctor would have some sort of answer for him. All he wanted was for his leg to go back to normal so he could play football again and ride his bike again. Just then, Adrian heard the door handle rattle, and Adrian's latest doctor walked into the room carrying several pieces of paper. The doctor looked down at the papers, then spoke to Adrian and his mother. On the positive side, the doctor said that Adrian did not have heart disease, kidney failure, or a host of other very serious conditions. But the doctor said he had to admit that he didn't know why Adrian's leg was swollen, and so he didn't know how to make it stop. So the doctor ultimately advised Adrian and his mother to just kind of leave the leg alone and let it heal on its own. Adrian couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been watching his leg grow bigger and bigger for almost 6 months, making it nearly impossible for him to do more and more everyday things. Why couldn't the doctors figure out what was wrong? A few months later, Adrian was sitting in class when the bell sounded to signal the end of the period. Students sprang out of their seats, rushing out of the classroom, but Adrian just sat there and waited for the crowd to thin. Then, when they were all gone, he braced his hands on the desk and pushed himself up to stand with a grunt. As soon as he began to walk, he felt a shooting pain in his right ankle, and he nearly fell over into a table. It had been months since Adrian had seen that doctor that said, just wait this out, but clearly his leg was not getting better. It was just getting worse. By the spring of 2006, his right leg was nearly double the size of his left leg. It looked like the leg belonged to a totally different body. Adrian had started wearing these really baggy jeans in an attempt to hide his right leg, but all his classmates knew, and they were not shy about teasing him. As Adrian limped out of the classroom, he felt the students in the hallway shift their gaze to his leg. Some pointed at him and whispered or giggled as Adrian's cheeks burned red, but right now, Adrian's biggest problem was not embarrassment. It was the pain in his ankle. The sheer weight of his right leg was now so enormous, it felt like his foot was going to collapse with every step. Adrian gritted his teeth and kept his head down as he walked past all the students who were laughing at him, and he made his way to the nurse's office. Once he was there, he asked to make a phone call, and when he called his mother, he did his best to keep his voice steady as he told her she needed to come pick him up right now. About an hour later, Maricela stood in the emergency room, anxiously watching as a flurry of doctors and nurses surrounded her son. She stayed by Adrian's side as he was put in a wheelchair and rushed him from one exam room to another. Once again, the doctors took x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs. They measured the diameter of his right leg and compared it to the information Maricela had given them about how much it had grown. They listened intently as Adrian explained all of his symptoms. Maricela thought this actually seemed different from all their other doctors' visits. Like finally now, these doctors were taking Adrian's issues really seriously. Maricela hoped this was the turning point that Adrian had been waiting for, and that the medical team would finally be able to figure out what this was and then help her son. After spending much of the day at the hospital, Maricela brought the car around to the front entrance to pick up her son. A nurse wheeled Adrian outside, and Maricela helped him out of the wheelchair and into the passenger seat. She squeezed Adrian's hand as they pulled out of the driveway. They'd be back here in 3 weeks for the test results. For now, all they could do was hope for the best. After a long 3 weeks, Maricela and Adrian were back at the hospital to go over Adrian's test results. Maricela sat next to her son in the exam room, her hands clammy as they waited for the doctor. Maricela could also feel the anxiety radiating off of Adrian as he quickly flipped through a book, no doubt just trying to distract himself. Finally, the door opened and the doctor strolled in. He sat down in the chair opposite from the mother and son, and he glanced down at his clipboard before turning his gaze to Adrian. In a calm tone, he told Adrian that the good news was that they did have a diagnosis and it was not life-threatening. These last few weeks, Maricela hadn't dared speak the words out loud to Adrian, but secretly, she worried her son had cancer or some other deadly disease. So to hear this was not life-threatening was just such a relief. But Maricela's sense of relief lasted only about a second, because the doctor then told Adrian that he had something called elephantiasis, which is a rare disorder that causes the lower half of the body to thicken and swell. He explained that when someone has elephantiasis, the natural fluids that surround all the tissues in our bodies get blocked and begin to build up. And in Adrian's case, it was affecting his right leg, causing it to swell and become huge. Maricela turned to her son and asked if he was okay, but instead of answering her, he just looked at the doctor and asked if they could fix it. The doctor took his glasses off, set them down on his knee, and with a solemn look on his face, he told Adrian, unfortunately, there was no cure for this. If they'd caught it when Adrian was younger, they could have given him medicine that might have stopped his leg from swelling, but now there was no way to reverse it. Adrian's leg would never go back to its normal size, and the only thing he could do was wear compression stockings to reduce the discomfort. Maricela watched as her son's lip began to quiver, and then tears began to well up in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around her son and began to smooth his hair back. The doctor excused himself to give Maricela and Adrian some privacy. He said he was so sorry he couldn't be more helpful. After the doctor was gone, Adrian looked up at his mother and he told her that he wasn't sure if he could keep going to school with his leg looking like this. He was going to get bullied constantly. Maricela was thinking the same thing, but she told him it would be okay, they'd find a way to make school more comfortable for him. She said she would do whatever she could to support him. Adrian leaned on his mother's shoulder as they slowly made their way out of the hospital towards their car. Then they drove in silence all the way home. Three years later, Adrian slowly limped into class, mouthing the word "sorry" to his teacher, Mr. Perez. Adrian was used to arriving late for pretty much everything by now thanks to his leg, which only continued to grow. Now, as a junior in high school, his leg was nearly triple the diameter of a normal man's thigh, and it weighed about 150 pounds all by itself. Adrian's leg was so big, he couldn't even fit it in a normal wheelchair anymore. Teachers let Adrian leave his class 10 minutes early to give him extra time, but he was still almost always late to his next class. Some teachers got annoyed, but Mr. Perez didn't mind. Adrian hobbled to the back of the class, wincing as he took his seat. He was still a good student, making great grades and participating in class, but that was partly because, by this point, schoolwork was pretty much the only thing Adrian could do. He couldn't play sports, and he didn't hang out with his friends anymore, and he barely left the house except to go to class. And now, Adrian had yet another problem. Seemingly overnight, a swath of itchy pimples had sprung up on his leg. And so he wriggled in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, when suddenly he felt something burst on his right leg. Adrian looked down in horror as he saw a wet stain begin to seep through the fabric of his jeans. And then an awful smell wafted up to his nose. One of Adrian's new pimples had burst, and it smelled disgusting, like rotten eggs, but even worse. Adrian carefully glanced around the classroom, seeing if anybody else had noticed yet. Mr. Perez stood up in front, writing math equations on the whiteboard. Most of the other kids were copying down notes, but the students right in front of Adrian, so near the back of the classroom, they began swiveling their heads around to face Adrian while wrinkling their noses. As the smell fanned out towards the front of the room, more and more students began to notice. They started looking around, pinching their noses with their fingers, and muttering about not being able to breathe. Adrian stared down at his desk, unbelievably mortified, not daring to make eye contact with anyone. Every time Adrian thought he could not be more humiliated by his leg, there was always a new low, and this was it. It was bad enough that everybody made fun of him because of how big his leg was, but now his legs smelled bad too. Adrian hung his head in shame and began counting the seconds until he'd be able to leave school and go back home. Later that week, Adrian struggled out of his jeans in an exam room at a dermatologist's office. As he did, Adrian scrunched up his nose in disgust because, without his pants sort of masking the smell, the odor from his right leg now overpowered the room. Adrian wrapped a disposable gown around his waist and then sat down in the exam chair. After a few minutes, Adrian heard a knock at the door, and the doctor entered the room. He gave Adrian a big smile, and he asked what brought him in today. Adrian tried to match the doctor's upbeat energy, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. Instead, he started talking about the itchy pimples on his leg. After Adrian finished explaining, the doctor said, "Okay, let me see your leg." And so Adrian slowly reached down and pulled aside his gown, revealing his swollen, pimple-covered leg. And it was obvious the doctor was really caught off guard by what he was seeing. But after the initial shock wore off, the doctor kind of composed himself and then told Adrian and Maricela that he'd never seen such a big leg before. Adrian immediately looked over at his mother and stifled a groan. He was looking for help from this doctor, not to be treated like some science experiment or circus act. Finally, the doctor slipped on some latex gloves and leaned in for a closer look. And after a few minutes of poking and prodding, the doctor explained that these were not pimples on Adrian's legs, but instead they were pus-filled blisters. And unfortunately, he didn't know what was causing them. Then he reminded Adrian to make sure he was taking regular showers to keep his leg clean. Adrian suddenly wished the reclining chair he was on would just swallow him whole, so he didn't have to sit here while the dermatologist lectured him about taking showers. Usually, the doctor's office was the only place Adrian did not feel self-conscious about his leg. But thanks to this dermatologist, even that was no longer true. A few days later, Adrian was back at school, sitting in Mr. Perez's class. Mr. Perez could see that Adrian looked absolutely miserable. He knew Adrian's leg must be impacting his quality of life, but the teacher didn't know much about Adrian's situation beyond what he observed in class. The teacher wasn't one to get involved in his students' personal lives, but something in Mr. Perez told him this was an unusual situation where maybe he could make a difference. So instead of letting Adrian leave his class early like usual, Mr. Perez actually asked him to stick around after the bell rang. And then once the bell rang and the other students had left the room, Mr. Perez made his way to the back of the class where Adrian was sitting nervously waiting for him. Mr. Perez quickly reassured Adrian that he was not in trouble. He explained that he noticed Adrian looked really upset and wanted to make sure he was okay. For a few moments, Adrian sat in silence, looking down at the desk, and when he looked up, Mr. Perez could see his eyes were full of emotion. Before long, Adrian told Mr. Perez the whole terrible story of how his leg had grown more and more deformed for years, and no doctor seemed able to do anything to help. It was like Adrian had been waiting for someone to ask him what was wrong, and now the floodgates were open. Later that week, Mr. Perez sat next to Adrian in the school library, scouring the internet for information on elephantiasis. Adrian had explained his diagnosis and how there was no cure, but Mr. Perez figured there had to be something they could do. The pair had been meeting in the library during their lunch periods to use the school computers to see if maybe the doctors had missed something. As Mr. Perez read through another medical article, Adrian, who was right next to him, began laughing at a video of a dog riding a skateboard. Ever since they'd started coming to the library, Adrian had seemed happier. Mr. Perez suspected that Adrian hadn't had a friend for a long time. Mr. Perez turned back to his computer, where he had a tab open to elephantiasis symptoms. He read through the list in a hushed voice, verifying each one with Adrian, and as Mr. Perez read on, they realized something strange. Adrian had some of the symptoms of elephantiasis, but other symptoms, such as persistent coughing and chills, were way off. And so a strange thought crossed Mr. Perez's mind. Maybe Adrian did not have elephantiasis. Maybe he had something else entirely. Later that night, Mr. Perez was home, working at his desktop computer. He couldn't stop thinking about the discovery he and Adrian had made at lunch. So he created a new document in Microsoft Word and started typing out all the other types of diseases that could cause a person's leg to swell up as much as Adrian's had. One by one, he compared the list of symptoms for each disease to the symptoms Adrian experienced. And when they didn't match up, Mr. Perez would cross the potential diagnosis off his list and keep on going. After several hours, Mr. Perez was bleary-eyed but determined, and his list was shrinking. He took a sip of coffee, and then he clicked on a disease that he had never heard of before. As he read through the symptoms, his heart began to race. He couldn't believe it. This condition sounded like a perfect fit to what was going on with Adrian. Now he just needed to find an expert that could help. The reality was, Socorro, Texas was a small community without many medical resources. So Mr. Perez knew they would not be able to get Adrian the specialized care he needed here. So Mr. Perez searched the web for experts in this disease he had identified all over the country. And after digging through hospital directories and online forums, he came across a doctor in New York who might be able to help. 2 weeks later, Dr. Robert Rosen sat down in his oversized desk chair after a long day of surgeries and patient consultations in his busy New York office. He surveyed the stacks of letters and paperwork that littered his desk, and he sighed. He doubted he'd make it home in time for dinner. He leaned forward and began rifling through the documents when he noticed a large manila envelope peeking out from under a cluster of papers. Dr. Rosen pulled out the parcel, surprised by how heavy it was. The return address was in Texas. Curious, the doctor ripped open the seal and spread the contents out in front of him. His eyes grew wide as he took in the slew of medical records and test results. Then he saw the photograph of Adrian Martinez and nearly fell out of his chair. In his 30 years as an endovascular surgeon, Dr. Rosen had only seen a handful of cases like this one, and none were this severe. The photo showed Adrian sitting on a couch with his right leg extended. The boy's leg took up practically the entire sofa. It was full of folds and crevices and absolutely massive. There was a letter from Adrian's mother explaining that her son desperately needed help. The doctors in Texas had diagnosed Adrian with elephantiasis, but it just didn't seem right. Her son wasn't getting any better, and now she worried for his life. Dr. Rosen looked back over the medical records, and sure enough, he saw that Adrian had been diagnosed with elephantiasis. But just as Adrian's mother and Mr. Perez had suspected, that diagnosis was definitely wrong. Dr. Rosen grabbed the photograph again and studied the pink mark that now covered the bulk of Adrian's right leg. That was it, the doctor thought to himself. That birthmark was the key. A few days later, Adrian huddled with his mother at the kitchen table, anxiously waiting for their phone to ring. They were expecting a call from Dr. Rosen any minute to discuss what was really wrong with Adrian's leg. When the phone finally rang, Maricela jumped to answer it, putting the phone on speaker and placing the phone on the table in front of her and Adrian. Dr. Rosen introduced himself, and Adrian immediately began to relax. He'd been waiting for this moment for years. Whatever happened next, at least Adrian would get some answers. Dr. Rosen started by telling Adrian that he did not have elephantiasis. He never did. Instead, Adrian had a very rare condition called Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, or KTS. The same disease Mr. Perez had suspected from his internet research. He explained that KTS is something you're born with, and what it does is it causes the blood vessels in someone's arm or leg to warp and twist. which makes it hard for blood and other fluids to be distributed properly throughout that limb. In Adrian's case, the blood and fluid had pooled in his right leg, causing intense swelling. And it started happening when he hit puberty because sometimes hormonal changes act as the trigger for KTS. Dr. Rosen said that KTS can be hard to diagnose because it is so uncommon, affecting just 1 out of every 100,000 people. But there's usually a telltale sign that's visible from birth, a pinkish-purple birthmark on one leg, just like the one Adrian had. With time, the birthmark can thicken and develop painful blisters, another one of Adrian's symptoms, and those blisters were actually Dr. Rosen's main concern, because those blisters were full of infected bodily fluids, which is why the pus that poured out of them smelled so bad. Dr. Rosen paused for a moment before continuing. He said that the infection can spread very quickly throughout the body, and in some cases it can cause high blood pressure or even a stroke and organ damage. Dr. Rosen warned that Adrian's condition was actually so serious that there was a chance the KTS could actually kill him, and unfortunately there was no cure. Adrian's heart raced as Dr. Rosen told him that he now had an almost impossible decision that he would have to make. He said that Adrian could continue to just live with his KTS, risking his life daily, or he could undergo a surgery that he would only have a 50% chance of surviving. In October of 2009, Adrian was wheeled into surgery. Adrian had weighed the pros and cons out, and as terrifying as it was, he knew his only chance at a happy, normal life was to risk the operation, which was a very complicated leg amputation. The procedure took 12 hours, but Adrian did survive, and the surgery was a success. Once Adrian recovered, he returned to school in a wheelchair. He was 150 pounds lighter, and it felt like he was floating through the halls. He finished out his junior year with straight A's and spent the summer adjusting to his new life. And without his leg holding him back, Adrian blossomed in other ways too. He grew more confident, and he rebuilt the social life that he'd lost. And Adrian was so grateful to the adults who didn't give up on him, and he and Mr. Perez stayed really good friends. He went on to attend the University of Texas at El Paso, and in 2019, he graduated with 2 degrees in computer science and business. On the morning of October 4th, 1961, Andrea Russo hurried down the hallway of her home in Fresno, California. She rounded the corner into her 8-year-old son Tommy's room, and there was Tommy on the floor surrounded by toys. As Andrea expected, her son had not gotten dressed for school yet. Andrea couldn't help but smile, but at the same time they were running late and there was no time to play right now. So she grabbed some clothes from his dresser and then dropped down onto the floor next to him. She slipped his favorite red and white striped t-shirt over his head and then unfolded a new pair of blue jeans for him to step into. Then she handed him some sneakers and said, "Put those on." Andrea jumped to her feet and ran back to the kitchen. There, she grabbed 2 slices of bread and stuck them in the toaster, and when the toast popped back up, Andrea put the slices on a plate and sprinkled them with cinnamon and sugar, her son's favorite breakfast. With her son's breakfast in one hand, Andrea grabbed Tommy and led him out to the car, his shoes still untied. She helped her son climb into the back seat and then handed him his toast. As Andrea drove her son to school, she passed by huge fields of lush farmland where tomatoes, barley, and almonds were growing. She saw a small helicopter hovering over one farm, raining clear liquid down onto the crops below. Andrea knew the plane must be spraying the field with pesticides. For her, this was a familiar scene. Fresno was an agricultural town. But when Andrea turned around and looked into the back seat to check on Tommy, she saw him staring at the helicopter with wide eyes, shoving the last bites of cinnamon sugar toast into his mouth. He'd seen large industrial spraying machines before, but this helicopter was new and interesting. Andrea continued down the road away from the farm. She pulled up outside Tommy's elementary school just as the bell was ringing. She helped him out of the back seat, gave him a hug, and told him to have a good day. She watched him run inside, nearly tripping over his shoelaces. Then Andrea got back in her car and headed home. A few hours later, Andrea was in the laundry room folding Tommy's clothes when the telephone rang. She ran to the living room and picked up the call, and it was Tommy's teacher. The teacher sounded very concerned. She said that something seemed very off about Tommy. Normally, he was always smiling and paying attention in class, but today he'd been acting totally lethargic all morning. Instead of being involved in the lessons, he just kind of stared into space with his eyes glazed over. And when it was time for recess, he didn't even want to go outside. Andrea was surprised. Her son had seemed perfectly fine that morning, and he would never skip recess, even if he had a cold or a stomachache. So she knew he must be feeling really sick. She told the teacher she'd be there to pick him up soon. Andrea hung up the phone, grabbed her keys, and drove straight to the elementary school. As soon as she pulled up to the curb, she saw Tommy trudge out the front door. He dragged his feet with each step. He hadn't even bothered to put his backpack onto his shoulders. He just pulled it on the ground right behind him. When Tommy made it to the car, he crawled into the back seat and closed his eyes without saying a word. Andrea asked if he was okay, but all Tommy did was shake his head, no. Andrea had never seen her son like this before. Andrea worried that Tommy was more than just tired, so she called Tommy's pediatrician as soon as she got home. Luckily, the doctor could see them right away. At the pediatrician's office, a receptionist led them into an examination room and said the pediatrician would be there soon. Andrea helped her son up onto an exam table covered with a thin sheet of paper. She held his shoulders and looked into his eyes. They were glassy and unfocused. As soon as she let go of his shoulders, he laid down sideways on the exam table and shut his eyes. Andrea didn't know if she should wake him up or let him rest, but before she could decide, the doctor knocked softly on the door and then came into the room. The doctor was an older man with dark hair, the same pediatrician Tommy had had since he was a baby. Andrea was relieved to see a familiar face. She told the doctor about her son's sudden exhaustion that day and how his teachers were very concerned about him. Then she gently shook Tommy's shoulder, and gradually he sat up. The pediatrician gave Tommy a quick examination. He checked the 8-year-old's pulse, his blood pressure, and temperature. He looked down the boy's throat and shined a light in his eyes. Then he turned to Andrea and said that all of Tommy's vital signs seemed normal. He didn't think there was anything to worry about. Tommy was probably just tired, so she should take him home and let him rest. Andrea hesitated. Tommy had never acted like this when he was just tired, so she had a nagging suspicion that something else might be going on here. But at the same time, she wanted to believe this doctor, so she ultimately just followed his advice. Andrea brought Tommy back out to the car and drove home. About 20 minutes later, she pulled into their driveway and walked around the car to help her son out of the back seat. However, when she opened the back door of the car, Tommy didn't even open his eyes. Andrea asked Tommy if he was okay, but he seemed confused, like he could barely form a thought. He was even more out of it than he had been earlier. Very concerned, Andrea got into the front seat and sped right back to the doctor's office. She parked her car, grabbed Tommy out of the back seat, and carried him inside. It had been less than an hour since they'd left, and the receptionist looked confused to see them again. But Andrea told her that they needed to see the doctor again right now. This was an emergency. The receptionist nodded and ran to get the doctor. But then suddenly, Tommy blurted out that he had to use the bathroom, and he got up and ran to the restroom so quickly that Andrea couldn't keep up. Tommy flung open the door and slammed it shut. From outside in the hall, Andrea could hear her son retching. Tommy vomited, and then he had diarrhea. When he came out of the bathroom, he looked absolutely miserable. By this point, the doctor had come out into the waiting area. He and Andrea helped Tommy walk to the exam room, and as soon as they got inside, Tommy collapsed onto the table, barely conscious. The doctor's eyes went wide. He raced over to Tommy and checked his vitals again. Then he turned to Andrea and told her Tommy's heart rate was extremely high. She asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head. He had never seen anything like this before. But the doctor did say he knew someone who might be able to help. His name was Dr. John Conrad, and he was the leading pediatrician in the Fresno area, and he specialized in pediatric allergies. If anyone could identify what was causing Tommy's rapid decline, it was him. The doctor rushed out of the room to call Dr. Conrad, leaving Andrea alone with Tommy. Andrea felt so helpless. Her son was becoming desperately ill, and she couldn't do anything except watch as his eyelids fluttered and he struggled to breathe. Across town, Dr. John Conrad held the phone against his ear and jotted down the symptoms Tommy's pediatrician described. Dr. Conrad was an older man with white hair and clear-rimmed glasses. He'd spent many years practicing pediatric medicine and felt like he'd seen it all already. And as he eyed the list of symptoms he had just jotted down, he actually immediately came up with a theory about Tommy's illness. He suspected that the 8-year-old might have type 1 diabetes and could be on the verge of falling into a diabetic coma. Type 1 diabetes usually shows up during adolescence, but it can strike younger children too, and the symptoms can arise very suddenly. People with diabetes can't properly digest sugar, and so something as simple as eating a sugary breakfast or going too long without a snack can send them spiraling toward a diabetic coma. Dr. Conrad told the pediatrician to send Andrea and Tommy to the Valley Children's Hospital in Fresno, and he would meet them there. Dr. Conrad then immediately called that hospital and asked the staff to be ready to test Tommy for diabetes as soon as he and his mother arrived. Then Dr. Conrad ran out to his car and made his way to the hospital. Valley Children's Hospital was a single-story brick building that was lined with trees. When Dr. Conrad walked inside, a nurse with a long ponytail and blue scrubs approached him. The nurse told him that Andrea and Tommy were already there, and the diabetes test that Dr. Conrad had requested had come back. The results were negative, meaning whatever was happening to Tommy was not type 1 diabetes. And that wasn't all. As they walked towards Tommy's room, the nurse said they'd run other blood tests in addition to checking for diabetes. Now, most had come back normal, but Tommy's white blood cell count was extremely high, which meant his body was clearly fighting off something. Dr. Conrad thought about this. Most likely, Tommy was fighting off an infection, maybe in his intestinal tract, that would explain the vomiting and diarrhea. Dr. Conrad felt like he might be onto something, but he would need to examine Tommy himself to figure out more. Tommy was curled up in the hospital bed when Dr. Conrad came in. His mother hovered over him, looking totally exhausted and terrified. When she saw Dr. Conrad come in, she ran over, clasped his hand, and said how happy she was to see him. The doctor could feel the young mother's fear in her handshake, and it made him even more determined to get to the bottom of Tommy's illness as quickly as possible. Tommy almost looked like he was sleeping, except that his hands and feet were twitching. Dr. Conrad checked his pulse, and Tommy's heart was still racing. The doctor asked Tommy how he was feeling, but Tommy seemed too confused to even speak. In fact, he could barely even open his eyes. And when he did, Dr. Conrad saw that Tommy's pupils had constricted into 2 tiny black dots. The doctor wasn't sure what to make of the muscle twitches and the constricted pupils, but he still thought that Tommy might have an intestinal infection, so he wanted to examine the 8-year-old's abdomen. Dr. Conrad moved the blankets out of the way and very lightly pressed on the boy's belly, and immediately Tommy screamed in agony. The doctor pulled his hand away reflexively. The severity of Tommy's reaction really surprised him, but it also made an intestinal infection seem much more likely. Dr. Conrad wondered if maybe Tommy had consumed a relatively common bacteria called Shigella that often spreads in places like elementary schools. Thinking this could be the answer, Dr. Conrad asked hospital staff to run a test for Shigella because as soon as they got confirmation that that was what it was, they could begin treating Tommy. But 2 hours later, Dr. Conrad sat in the hallway outside of Tommy's room and read over the test results. Tommy had tested negative for Shigella infection. Dr. Conrad shook his head as he reviewed Tommy's symptoms. The boy was pale and feverish with extremely small pupils, his heart rate was abnormally high, his muscles were twitching, and his white blood cell count was elevated. The boy was experiencing confusion and extreme stomach pain. He seemed to be floating in and out of consciousness. Dr. Conrad put all these details together, and then he had a deeply unsettling thought. What if this boy has been poisoned? Dr. Conrad took a deep breath. Tommy's symptoms actually reminded him of a patient he'd once treated, a farmer who'd come down with sudden exhaustion, muscle twitches, and vomiting. That sounded a lot like what Tommy was going through. It turned out the farmer had been poisoned by the organic phosphates in the pesticides he applied to his crops. He had accidentally inhaled some of the chemicals in the process. Dr. Conrad wondered if maybe something similar could have happened to Tommy. Fresno was, after all, an agricultural community, so it was possible that the 8-year-old could have, in theory, inhaled pesticide by accident. Even a tiny amount would be enough to cause extreme symptoms within just a few hours. Dr. Conrad realized that he needed to act fast. Organic phosphates were powerful poisons. If he didn't give Tommy an antidote quickly, this little boy could die. 5 minutes later, Dr. Conrad rushed back into Tommy's room carrying a syringe that contained a medicine called atropine. The doctor carefully injected this drug into Tommy's arm as the boy lay completely still, except for the twitching in his hands and feet. It was the same medication that Dr. Conrad had used with that farmer, and he prayed this would work for Tommy too. While they monitored the boy's condition, Dr. Conrad asked hospital staff to run a blood test for organic phosphate poisoning. A few hours later, around 8:30 p.m., the results of that test came back. Dr. Conrad's hunch was correct. Tommy was suffering from organic phosphate poisoning. The doctor broke the news to Tommy's mother. He was still wondering where exactly the poison had come from, so he asked Andrea if she'd taken her son around any of the local farms recently. Andrea thought for a moment. She said she always drove by some fields while taking Tommy to school. That very morning, they'd passed a helicopter that was spraying a farm with pesticides, but she and Tommy had been inside the car with all the windows up. She told Dr. Conrad that she didn't understand how that could have made Tommy so sick. The doctor wasn't sure either. Whatever had happened, it seemed like a freak accident. Pesticide poisonings were actually very rare. What mattered was that Dr. Conrad had acted quickly and the atropine worked perfectly. By 10 p.m., Tommy was sitting up in his hospital bed. His color had come back, his muscles had stopped twitching, he was able to have a full conversation with the doctor. Tommy said his stomach pain was gone too, but he still felt really tired. Dr. Conrad told Andrea it would take a few days in the hospital for Tommy to make a full recovery, but her son would be okay. Then he asked her to schedule a follow-up appointment with him 1 week after Tommy was discharged, and then Dr. Conrad said goodnight and headed for home, satisfied that he'd solved the mystery. 6 days later, there was no trace of poison left in Tommy's system, and so he was finally healthy enough to go home from the hospital. Andrea packed up their belongings and led Tommy to the parking lot. He skipped along beside her, and instead of talking about his illness or his time in the hospital, he just chatted about his Tonka trucks. When they got in the car, Tommy jumped into the back seat without her help. He was so excited to go home. But despite how energetic her son seemed, Andrea still felt nervous. She was happy that Tommy was coming home, but she wouldn't feel at ease until the checkup with Dr. Conrad the following week. For the next 6 days, Andrea did not take any chances. She kept her son at home and resting in bed. She wouldn't let him go to school, play outside, or even leave the house. It actually wasn't until the day of his doctor's appointment the week after that Tommy finally swapped out his PJs for real clothes and finally walked outside. Andrea helped him into the back seat and drove to Dr. Conrad's office. The white-haired doctor greeted Tommy with a smile. He gave the boy a thorough examination and assured Andrea that her son was doing just fine. When Tommy heard that, he hopped up and tugged on Andrea's arm. She looked down at her son, who had a huge smile spread across his face, and he said he couldn't wait to go back to school and see his friends again. Relieved, Andrea thanked Dr. Conrad and headed back out to the parking lot. Tommy sprinted ahead of her, anxious to get back home. As Andrea drove through Fresno on the way home, she felt like she could finally breathe. Her son had never been that sick before. Seeing him suffer like that had been terrifying, and she hadn't been able to relax until just now, when Dr. Conrad promised that really everything was all right. And so now they could finally get back to their normal lives. Andrea turned into her neighborhood, looking forward to a weekend at home before Tommy went back to school. But then her son called out to her from the back seat. He said his stomach was starting to hurt again. When Andrea turned to look at him, she saw him breathing rapidly, and there were beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. All of Andrea's dread came rushing back. She immediately turned around and sped back to Dr. Conrad's office. As she drove, Andrea repeatedly checked on Tommy in the rearview mirror, watching his condition get worse and worse by the second. When they were about 10 minutes away, all the color suddenly drained out of Tommy's face. Then his whole body kind of went slack and he slumped over and collapsed onto his side. Andrea slammed on the gas pedal. She could not get to Dr. Conrad's office fast enough. By the time she finally skidded into the parking lot, she was in a complete panic. She didn't even bother to bring her son inside with her. She just got out of the car and sprinted into the doctor's office alone. A few moments later, Andrea rushed back outside with the doctor, and they went to her car and they found Tommy still laying in the back seat, completely still and silent. To Andrea's surprise, Dr. Conrad actually flung open the passenger side door and got inside. And then he told Andrea to get in and drive us to the Valley Children's Hospital. They had no time to waste. "20 minutes later, Andrea carried her semi-conscious son through the sliding doors of the hospital emergency room. Tommy's head lolled on her shoulder. Dr. Conrad ran beside her and yelled for the nurses to hook the 8-year-old up to an IV. A hospital staff member grabbed Tommy from Andrea's arms and placed him on a gurney. As nurses swarmed around them, Andrea felt her throat tighten with fear. The nurses pushed Tommy's gurney down the hallway, and Andrea chased after them, following them into a hospital room. Suddenly, she heard her son screaming, his face contorted in pain as the nurses worked to connect an IV. Andrea watched, helpless, while her son began to gag. He tried to lift his head, but he couldn't sit up, and so he vomited just onto the bed. Then, Tommy stopped moving altogether as tears filled his eyes. Andrea didn't understand how or why this was happening again. All she knew was that Tommy's symptoms were even worse than the first time. Andrea was terrified. But she had never been more thankful for Dr. Conrad. He told hospital staff to make sure they administer more atropine. Andrea stood next to her son's bed and just prayed the atropine would work the way it did the first time. Sure enough, a few hours later, Tommy was awake and his stomach pain had subsided. He asked for a glass of water, and when a nurse brought it in, he was able to reach out and grab it. Tommy wasn't confused anymore, he could move his limbs, so clearly the atropine had saved his life again. Andrea was obviously extremely relieved that her son had pulled through, but as she sat beside his hospital bed, she couldn't help but feel sick to her stomach. Clearly, something was poisoning her son, but if she didn't know what it was, how could she protect him? How could she make sure this did not happen a third time or more? Andrea noticed Dr. Conrad packing up his black bag to leave. Before he left, she pulled him aside and asked him for his help. She needed to know where this chemical poisoning was coming from. If it really was from a local farm like Dr. Conrad thought, then Andrea wanted to know exactly which one. That way, they could tell the farmer to please contain the poison and put a stop to this nightmare. When Dr. Conrad got home that evening, he sat down on his couch and made a list of every farm in the area. He picked up the phone off the side table and started calling them one by one. He asked if they'd recently sprayed any organic phosphate pesticides on their crops. They all told Dr. Conrad the same thing: no. There was not a single farmer in Fresno who had sprayed organic phosphates in the last few weeks. Dr. Conrad crossed the last farm off his list and hung up the phone. He was baffled. If the poison wasn't from a farm, where else could Tommy have come in contact with it? The doctor spent the entire evening pacing in his living room, racking his brain for another answer. He eventually went to bed, hoping he'd be able to come up with a plausible theory in the morning. But he woke up just as confused. As he crawled out of bed and started a pot of coffee, he had to admit that he needed help. Dr. Conrad sat back down on the couch and placed his coffee mug on the side table right next to the telephone. Then he picked up that telephone and he called the Fresno County Public Health Department and told them the whole story. There was a little boy suffering from repeated pesticide poisonings for no clear answer as to how he was being exposed to the deadly chemicals. The health department official asked some follow-up questions, like what Tommy had been doing before he became ill, and Dr. Conrad didn't really have all the answers, but he explained that the previous afternoon, he had examined Tommy and given him a clean bill of health. Then, before the boy even made it back to his home, he became gravely ill again. His symptoms had appeared in less than an hour, and all Tommy had done was ride in the back seat of his mother's car. But that little detail of the boy riding in his mother's car caught the health department representative's attention. They assured Dr. Conrad they would get to the bottom of this, beginning with a thorough inspection of Andrea's vehicle. Later that morning, a man and a woman from the Fresno County Public Health Department knocked on Andrea's front door. Andrea shook their hands and welcomed them inside, but before she could say how happy she was to see them, they started asking questions. Did she keep any kind of chemical poisons in the house? Had she ever used ant or roach poison inside? Did she have a garden, and if so, did she treat her plants with pesticides? Andrea just shook her head. She didn't know of anything in her home or her car that could possibly be poisoning her son. She led the health department employees into her garage where her car was parked, and she watched them search every inch of her vehicle. After a few minutes, they came up empty-handed. Then they combed through the rest of her garage, but again, they didn't find anything. That only left one other option, the inside of Andrea's house. So Andrea opened the door for the investigators and told them to go ahead. As they searched, Andrea sat on the living room couch and called the hospital to check in on Tommy, who had been admitted to that hospital. The nurse would tell her that her son was stable and improving steadily. Andrea felt very relieved and placed the phone back on the hook. For the next hour, Andrea listened as the man and woman from the health department combed her entire house looking for the poison. But when they came into the living room where Andrea was, she asked them, "What have you found?" And they would tell her, nothing. There wasn't anything in her home, in her car, her garage, her garden, anywhere that could explain her son's poisoning. Andrea was totally crushed. But the two health department employees said they did have one more idea. They asked Andrea what her son had been wearing when he got sick. Andrea thought about it for a moment. The first time Tommy got sick, he had been wearing his favorite red and white striped t-shirt and a new pair of blue jeans and sneakers. The second time, he'd been wearing a different shirt, different shoes, but the same pair of blue jeans. They were actually in the laundry room in a pile of dirty clothes. She'd brought them home from the hospital, but she hadn't had a chance to wash them yet. When she said that, the investigators' eyes lit up. They told Andrea they needed those jeans right now. Those pants just might hold the answers to her son's illness. Later that afternoon, Dr. Conrad stood in a white-walled lab at the Fresno County Health Department laboratory wearing gloves and a face mask. Next to him, the health department investigators who had just searched Andrea's home gazed into a rectangular glass tank full of hundreds of buzzing mosquitoes. Dr. Conrad held Tommy's blue jeans in his gloved hand. When the investigators gave him the okay, he lifted the lid on the tank and quickly put the jeans inside and then shut the lid before any mosquitoes could escape. 15 minutes later, the buzzing had stopped. The lab was silent. Dr. Conrad looked over and saw the two investigators grinning. That's when he realized this was the breakthrough they needed. Every single mosquito inside of that glass tank was now dead, and Tommy's pants had killed them. It would turn out Tommy's own genes were the things that were poisoning him. They were loaded with toxic organophosphates. Now, Dr. Conrad had new questions. Where had these genes come from, and how did they become laced with pesticide? He used the health department laboratory's phone to call Andrea and explain the results of the experiment. He could tell by her voice that she was both very surprised and also very relieved, and luckily she was actually able to explain the genes. She said she'd bought those jeans about a month earlier in September. A trucking company was having a salvage sale for damaged goods and happened to have some nice jeans in Tommy's size. The pants were so cheap that Andrea actually bought 5 pairs of them, although Tommy had only worn 1 pair so far. Dr. Conrad told Andrea that it was highly likely that all of the jeans she had purchased were poisoned, so Tommy should obviously never wear them again. That's when Andrea pointed out that she actually did not buy every pair of jeans at the salvage sale. She said there had still been an entire stack of them after she had left with her 5 pairs. Dr. Conrad suddenly felt his heart start to race. This story wasn't over. There were more poison jeans out there right now, and so more children might get sick. Dr. Conrad hung up the phone and rushed back over to the investigators so they could try to figure out what to do next. Over the following weeks, Dr. Conrad and the Fresno County Public Health Department learned that the poison jeans had been shipped 8 months earlier in early 1961. They were put in a truck alongside various chemicals, including a highly toxic organic phosphate pesticide called Phosdrin. During a trip from Fresno to Los Angeles, a container of Phosdrin had broken open, and over a gallon of the poison spilled onto a stack of jeans. Enough poison to kill 9,000 kids. When the truck finally got to Los Angeles, an employee brought the jeans to a store where they were supposed to be sold. But the manager of that store had noticed the pants were covered in oily-looking stains, so they sent them back to Fresno. The poisoned jeans were stored in a warehouse for the next 8 months until it was time for the trucking company's annual salvage sale. By then, the stains on the jeans had faded enough that customers didn't notice them. When Dr. Conrad and the health department contacted this trucking company, it was too late. The remaining pairs of the poisoned jeans had all been sold. The health department immediately went out and alerted the public to this crisis. And soon they received 11 more pairs of jeans that had all been bought at the salvage sale. So that made 16 pairs, including the jeans Andrea had bought. In total, 1 other boy was hospitalized from these poisonous jeans, and 4 other children also fell ill. But luckily, like Tommy, all the children who were affected by these poisonous jeans made full recoveries. 1 month later, California lawmakers introduced a bill to ban the shipment of dangerous chemicals alongside food or clothing. Tighter legal restrictions and higher industry standards have since made accidents like the one that poisoned Tommy much less common. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are